Okay, we're back on.
Oh, is this your job? Nice.
Hey, watch out, Nina. Okay, there we go.
Are you building it on the wall? Yes, that's so cool.
Okay, so
God, I actually do have a shot. That's a good idea.
there you go.
Exactly. I mean, no, for the photos. Doesn't get enough.
I love ice cream. If
travel together if you can 5 minutes.
Okay, I'd like to start the seminar. I'm Lars Rustam. I'm here now to introduce our today's speaker for the DNR seminar series, the soon-to-be Dr. Ellen George. We have her defense scheduled for, I think, in a month about.
Yes.
So Ellen comes to us originally from Washington State, with University of Puget Sound. See if I got that right. And then she spent time around the marine area. She went to the Caicos Islands for a semester. She went up into the Sierra Nevada mountains. That was a little bit too high, I think, for her. Then Shenandoah Mountains next, a little lower. She still hasn't quite found the right thing that she really wanted to do until she came to Michigan and the Great Lakes.
Yes.
So she went to Michigan, worked for USGS for a couple of years, and then here to continue working on Great Lakes in Lake Ontario, where she came in 2013, finished her master's with me in 2016. It's a project I was a little nervous getting a student for, because it was almost all winter work. And then I got this student applying that says, I love winter work. Maybe it has something to do with her Swedish roots. She does speak a little Swedish, so that's a good thing. So then she continued working on her Ciscoes. She worked now with Matt Hare and me on Cisco restoration in the Great Lakes. She has also done a lot of work outreach. If you all probably are much more into social media than I am, so you've done the hashtag Cisco Ellen. Is that what it's called?
I don't know, but we can start that.
She was a subunit.
Make it a thing, Twitter.
Subunit president. She worked on AGDER outreach committee, where I know you've done a lot of good work. Organizing Correcting workshops, both here at Cornell and at the symposium in Ashland. She is on the next Correcting meeting group working on, which is the next meeting is in Finland. She's on that scientific committee. She's been to France working on Correcting. She just seemed to love this fish. So we're really looking forward to hear her talk about it. And recently we also heard that she got the best PhD student in the Great Lakes Award in Fisheries. So,
thank you, Lars. Thank you very much for that great introduction, and I hope I don't let you down with the next 45 minutes after that great boost. I want to thank you all for coming to my PhD seminar today. Everybody who's here in person and also everyone who's joining online. True to form, I am live streaming this out to the masses, so think carefully about what questions you want to ask so that you sound smart to the interwebs. I'll be taking questions here, but Taylor is also monitoring the feed on Periscope and Twitter, so if there's any questions that come in on that, she'll be able to to ask them on your behalf. So today I'm going to be talking about Cisco restoration in Lake Ontario, and I'm sure this is an experience that many of you have had if you've done a seminar in this series, and that is that you put in for your seminar, and then months in advance you're asked to pick a title, and you haven't really thought about what you're going to talk about yet, so you give them something random. I mean, this actually did work out pretty well. I am going to talk about the history, habitat, and genetics of Cisco in Lake Ontario. But as I've been going through my dissertation and going over what I've done for the past 6 years, and thought about how my work has not only gone, like how it's been evolving not only in the last 6 years, but also how it fits into the scope of knowledge about Cisco in Lake Ontario, I really realized that it's much more than just a few individual projects that I've been working on. What I've been working on is more than just 6 years. It goes through the entire timeline of Cisco in upstate New York, from the very beginning of the commercial fishery in the early 1800s, and then through until today with the research that we're doing, and then into the future with some of the public outreach and science communication things we've been doing. And also, as we're beginning to wrap up this project and move on to future projects of other grad students, thinking about how Cisco are going to be impacted in the future by things like climate change. So not only do we talk about these things, but overall we're kind of just going through the past, present, and future of Cisco. So today we're going to chase Ciscoes right through the past, the present, and the future. And I hope you will come on this journey with me. So thank you. First, though, I should probably answer the question, what is a Cisco? That's a question I get a lot. Not very many people have heard of them. A Cisco is a fish of many names, and one of the names that they're often known by is lake herring. They are not a herring, though. They're not related to herring at all. They're actually more closely related to salmon. They're in the salmon family. And so just like trout and salmon and whitefish, which are in the same genus as them, they have an adipose fin, which is a little extra fleshy fin on the back near the tail. So that's how you can identify them as part of the salmon family. However, the common name lake herring is pretty fitting because ecologically they fill a very similar niche as herring do in the ocean. They fill that very similar niche in the Great Lakes. So they are a cold water schooling prey fish species in the Great Lakes. And what that means is they're cold water, so they don't hang out near shore in the summer where it's hot. They like to be way off in the deep water, in the deep cold water of the Great Lakes. And so if you think about some of the other warmer water species that you might be more familiar with, like bass or walleye or perch, you can see those in the nearshore warm areas in the summer, but you're not going to see a Cisco. Cisco only really come in nearshore to where more people would encounter them in the winter when it's really cold. They're schooling prey fish species, so they formed big, vast schools that used to amaze the early settlers of the area, and they wrote about uncountable numbers of millions of fish coming into spawn. And they're an important prey fish species for some of the big predators that we like to catch in the lake, so things like lake trout and Atlantic salmon. And in fact, they used to be one of the most abundant fish species in the lake. And Everman and Smith in the late 1800s wrote that in the Great Lakes, the lake herring or Cisco is more abundant than any other whitefish. It is taken in enormous quantities each year, and most of the lakes is the object of a special fishery. And I'm definitely going to talk about some of those fisheries today. In particular, fisheries of Lake Ontario. Here we are. You can't talk about fish or Cisco fisheries in Lake Ontario without talking about Chameau Bay, which was, back in the 1800s, the largest commercial fishery in the area. It was the site of the biggest spawning runs coming in near shore to spawn in the winter. And it's a place where the culture and the history are just completely intertwined with the Cisco fishery. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about that place today. And because of that, I figured I should pop a map up there and show you where it is so you know where I was talking about. Very far northeastern corner of the lake, near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, way up in the North Country in northern New York. But first, let's travel back in time. So I want you to cast your mind back very long ago, back to the early, mid-1800s, to a very different time. New York was a very different place in the early 1800s. We like to think of New York as part of the bustling, cosmopolitan East Coast, and so we think that in the 1800s it probably was already pretty developed and pretty settled, but that's not the case for the entirety of New York. upstate New York, and in particular Jefferson County, which is where Chameau is, was still very much considered frontier at that time in the early 1800s. If you think about mapping efforts in upstate New York, the Adirondacks in the early 1800s and even into the late 1800s was still less well mapped than a lot of places in the territories out west that were being settled by the pioneers. So if you look at some of the old maps of the time, there's just this big blank space up in upstate New York where they've kind of drawn some vague mountains. There's just mountains up there. I looked at one map that's just called it deer hunting country. So this was still very much considered the frontier in the early and mid-1800s. Chameau was pretty isolated from a lot of the rest of the East Coast at the time. They didn't get a railroad until the 1850s, and that was only less than a decade before the entire country was crossed by the Transcontinental Railroad. So still out in the boonies at that time. And this is the time frame that the Cisco fishery was really starting to boom in Lake Ontario and upstate New York, with the biggest fishery being centered in Chameau Bay. A lot of fisheries can be harvested throughout the year, but Cisco fishery is focused on the spawning run, which happens in November and December. And the reason is because this is the easiest time to access the fish. So usually in the summer, these fish are out in the cold water, deep water areas of the lake. But in November and December, it cools down enough that the fish come near shore, and then they spawn on shallow, rocky shores, shoals and shores in the near-shore areas of Lake Ontario. And this is where the fisheries were really targeting these spawning runs. An interesting fact about that, actually, is that a lot of the people who benefited the most from the Cisco fishery financially were actually farmers. And the reason for that is because it's a shore-based fishery, and they're catching these fish from shore. So the fishing rights belong to the farmers. And the farmers made a lot of money on the Cisco fishery, either by catching the fish themselves and selling it, or leasing out the fishing rights to other people. And a lot of the farms in the Chameau region and around eastern Lake Ontario were paid off by Cisco fishing money. So that's something to think about, being able to pay off your farm with some fish money. But they used a lot of different shore-based methods to catch these fish. The very earliest type of method used was called a scaff, or a scoop net, and it was a big square net that was basically on a giant seesaw on land, and they would lower the entire net down into the water and then wait, and hopefully something would swim over the top of it. And after a while, they would haul up on one end of the seesaw and lift all the fish up into the air, and then swing the net over and dump them on the land. So a low-cost method, maybe. You didn't have to buy a boat, but not very effective. Efficient, I would say, not very efficient. And so in 1820, seine nets were introduced to Jefferson County, and these quickly became the most popular ways to catch Cisco in eastern Lake Ontario. And how those work is it's a very, very long net, and a rowboat will take one end and drag it out into the lake and go in a huge circle, hopefully encircling a lot of fish, and then come back to the same spot on land. And then they would take those ends of the net and haul them in, and any of the fish that were caught in the big circle would get hauled onto land. And these nets were extremely efficient, and were able to encircle big spawning aggregations and drag them all onto land with not too much effort until the nets got bigger and bigger and bigger. And actually they got so big that they were no longer able to haul them in by manpower, and they started using teams of horses to drag these huge thousands of pounds of fish onto the shore at once. So you can imagine that that was taking a lot of fish out of the lake, especially during this really critical spawning time. One interesting fact I found out about Lake Ontario is that by the 1900s, most of the other lakes had switched to steam power to run these huge nets and haul in these big catches. But Lake Ontario is still stubbornly stuck with rowboats and shore fishing for some reason. They're just extra tough up there. And Chameau became really famous as the source of a lot of these of the fish that came from this fishery, to the point where the locals had a nickname called the Cisco Chasers, which is where the title of my talk comes from, Chasing Ciscoes. And a good story that I was reading is about the Erie Canal workers, and there were Erie Canal workers from areas all over the state. And all the workers from different areas of the state had different nicknames based on where they were from. And the Erie Canal workers from Chameau Bay were called Cisco Chasers. The reason for that was because they worked the canals in the summer and into the fall, and when the canals would shut down for the end of the season, all of the workers from Chameau would go back up to Chameau to catch fish and make more money. Not only were they the fish being eaten by the local population, but they were shipped all over the East Coast. So this is a newspaper ad from the Clayton Independent, 1895, that's advertising those delicious sugar-cured Chameau Ciscoes. And these kind of ads ran in newspapers all up and down the East Coast. And they shipped them down to New York City and as far down to Virginia and even some of the southern states as well. In the late 1800s, following the Civil War, and also into the early 1900s and the Depression, Cisco, smoked or salted Cisco was one of the cheapest sources of protein that you could buy. So they were really shipped all over for people to buy as a cheap meat source. But of course, it couldn't last forever, not with those huge seines pulling in all of those fish on every single haul. And the Cisco fishery collapsed in Ontario and in Chameau Bay starting in the 1870s. The gray line here is the Canadian catch. The black line, which doesn't have as much data, is the New York catch. You can see this one drop down here in 1870. There was a brief little exciting, encouraging peak in the 19-teens, but then nothing after that. And the fishery held on a little longer on the Canadian side, but by the mid-1900s, the fishery had completely collapsed across Lake Ontario. And it really collapsed like all these different spawning stocks. You can see individual spawning stocks collapsing year after year after year around the circumference of the lake. I'm talking today about Coregonus arteti, which is lake herring, or also called shallow water Cisco. But there actually were 3 deep water species of Cisco as well in the lake before the fishery collapsed. Those are now extinct in the lake. So they're completely destroyed by fishing, and they no longer are found in the lake. Okay, that is the sad, sad past. And now we are moving into the bright hope of the future. So come with me from the 1920s to 2004. This is where I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing over the last 6 years. It's for Cisco restoration in Lake Ontario. First, though, I should probably tell you why we want them back. So there's a couple different reasons, but aside from commercial fishery interests and recreational fishery interests, the reason that we're really interested in Cisco restoration now in Lake Ontario is because of their role in the food web. And one of these is because of the thiamine deficiency issue in the Great Lakes. So right now, the preyfish biomass in Lake Ontario is heavily dependent on alewife, rainbow smelt, and other invasive preyfish species in the lake. So for example, alewife, which are not native to Lake Ontario, are over 90% of the preyfish biomass in Lake Ontario. And the problem with alewife and rainbow smelt is that they're really high in this enzyme called thiaminase. And thiaminase breaks down vitamin B1, also called thiamine, in the bodies of predators that eat them. So that can lead to a vitamin deficiency. It can lead to reproductive failure, all sorts of bad things. But Cisco and lake whitefish and other native crayfish species are very low in this enzyme, and so they're a much better snack for growing lake trout and Atlantic salmon than the invasive species are. The other reason we're interested in bringing them back is in order to try and diversify our crayfish portfolio in the lake. So just like when you're a financial advisor, because you have one, right, grad students, tells you to try to invest in a lot of different things, right, in order to spread out your risk and in order to try and create resiliency in the future. We want to do the same thing with the food web. So right now, we have a lot invested in some really high-risk species, alewife or rainbow smelt. And that's like dumping all your money into high-risk stocks. But if we try to encourage restoration of Cisco, whitefish, bloater, some of these native crayfish species, then we can try to spread out the risk in the future and try to create a little bit more resilient food web moving forward in the face of climate change and some other future changes that might impact the lake. The other thing that we've been talking about recently is it seems like the lake is changing in a way that it's more ready for them to come back now. So the Lake Ontario today is very different than Lake Ontario in the mid-1900s. And all through the 1900s, Lake Ontario had a lot of pollution issues, a lot of runoff issues, phosphorus loading from nutrient runoff, and it was being increasingly eutrophied. However, after the Clean Water Act in 1972, and then the introduction of dreissenid mussels, so zebra and quagga mussels, in the 80s, the lake has really become more oligotrophic, and it seems to be shifting back towards more of a historical state, more like what it was like back in the 1800s and before, when Cisco were really abundant. One of the ways we see this is that now, as the lake is becoming more and more oligotrophic, we're seeing a consistent setup of a deep chlorophyll layer in the lake, which is really indicative of these stratified, deep, low nutrient oligotrophic lakes, and it's something that we see in Lake Superior, which is where a commercial fishery still exists for Cisco, so they still have enough Cisco around to maintain a commercial fishery. Another couple things are hinting towards Cisco coming back. One of those is that we've had a couple of poor years of alewife recruitment in the lake, and the alewife population has taken a hit because of that. And that's gotten people worried about the volatility of the alewife boom and bust population cycles. But even though we've had some poor year classes of alewife, we've actually had a couple really good year classes of Cisco recently. So we had really good recruitment events from the 2013-2014 year class, and have had a lot more adults coming back to spawn in recent years because of that. So it seems like the lake might be primed for a Cisco return right now. And one thing that was really encouraging on that is now we have Cisco back spawning in Chameau Bay, which is really exciting. In 2004, USGS and the DEC started catching spawning Cisco in the bay based on reports of some yellow perch fishermen who had started getting them in their gill nets at the end of the season. So for several years they were catching these adults coming back into the bay. They were full of eggs, they were spawning ready, but we still didn't know if they were actually spawning in the bay. They were there, but we don't know if they were laying their eggs. So in 2014, which was part of my master's research, we actually found eggs on Johnson Shoal for the first time. It was the first time we've been able to confirm spawning on Johnson Shoal in Chameau Bay in almost 100 years since the fishery collapsed. So it was really exciting that Cisco were now back in the bay. And since then, in the past several years, what started out as just like a few people out in a boat in December on Lake Ontario doing some sort of crazy thing out there has become this big collaborative effort that's got all of these agencies down here on the bottom working on it, and a lot of people are jumping on board. It's a Cisco bandwagon, and we've really just turned this into a big collaborative project. And I have to say that this is one of the things that I'm most proud of during the last 6 years, is the fact that this project has gotten so big and so open and so cooperative. It's been just a real treat to work with this group of people. So some of the things that we are trying to address moving forward with this big collaborative group of researchers are some of the big questions that we have about the Cisco population. One thing we have no idea of is how many Cisco populations there are out there. So we know they're coming back to Chameau. We also know that there's fish coming back to the Bay of Quinte in the fall around spawning time. But other than that, we weren't really sure if there were any other remnant populations around, if they were spawning in other historical spawning sites, and we just hadn't found them there yet. We really didn't know that. We had no idea how many Cisco were out there. We really didn't know why they were coming back. So all of a sudden Cisco start appearing in these nearshore areas and spawning, but we're not sure what environmental factors have led to their resurgence. And if we can figure those factors out, we might be able to figure out what kind of challenges they're facing. What's keeping them from coming back in a big way on their own? And if there are challenges that we identify, how can we help them overcome those challenges, and how can we help the population recover? So those are the goals of this big overall group of researchers. So in order to answer some of those questions, we've been looking at the Chameau Bay population and trying to learn from that population and then extrapolate it out across the lake and try to get some answers to some of these questions. This is a Sidescan Sonar Map, a habitat classification map of the shoals in Chameau Bay where Cisco were spawning. And Fish and Wildlife went out a few years ago and did a lot of side-scan sonar on the shoals to try and characterize what kind of substrate we're looking at. And then we can try to use this to look around the rest of the lake and see if we can identify other spawning habitat that's available in the eastern side of Lake Ontario. And most of the shoals in Chameau Bay were comprised of this exposed fractured bedrock, which you can see on the photo on the left. I do have a pointer. Photo on the left, you can see those long stripes, which are these long fractured pieces of bedrock sticking up out of the sediment. And then on the right, also some big stony rubble was comprising most of these shoals. So this is the kind of habitat that we were looking for. And taking that information, we went and looked all around eastern Lake Ontario, combed through the literature, looked for historical records of Cisco spawning, and also just went over all the bathymetric data we had to try to pick out any type of features or any locations around the eastern side of the lake that looked at all similar to the shoals in Chameau Bay. And once we did that, we set egg mats out on these areas. And the egg mats are metal frames, and then we've wrapped them in a hog's hair furnace filter. So just like the furnace filter that you might have in your own furnace at home. Binder clips, very high tech to hold them onto the frame. And these mats we set out on some of these areas that we identified that might have remnant spawning populations on them. And we set them out before spawning, and then when the fish come in to spawn, the eggs, float down and get stuck into the fibers of the mat, and then we're able to pull the mats up, count the eggs, figure out density and stuff like that. So using that method, we were able to identify 2 new spawning populations that we had not known about before. One near Fox and Grenadier Islands, which is just outside the mouth of Chameau Bay, and then another population in Henderson Harbor to the south of Chameau Bay. And that was really exciting. We're not really sure if these populations are new populations. So for example, the last few years, we've had a lot of adults returning to Chameau Bay because we had several good recruitment years. So we don't know if those fish are now spreading out and colonizing new habitats and forming new spawning aggregations, or if those represent remnant spawning populations that we didn't know about. And the reason we wouldn't know about them is because we just weren't looking for them. So we're not sure if they're new or old, but regardless, it was very exciting to find new spawning or different spawning populations that we hadn't known about previously, beyond just the Chameau Bay population that we had known about. It seems like there are other spawning populations in Lake Ontario. A lot of the questions that started to come up were we figured out that we were asking ourselves, I should say, we figured would actually be pretty well answered by genetics. And I didn't know that when I started IDing eggs using genetic barcoding, my little toe dip into genetics for the Cisco project, that I would end up doing most of my PhD on genetics. But that's how it worked out. And the reason is because we had these questions moving forward that genetics could help us answer. And a couple of those questions are about the genetic diversity of the population. So as this population is expanding, as it's moving potentially into new areas, as people are getting interested in taking broodstock from this population and maybe starting to stock fish back into the lake, we realized we really had no idea what the genetic diversity of the Lake Ontario population was. They went through a huge population collapse about 100 years ago. So we might think that they potentially could have also experienced a rather severe genetic bottleneck at that time too and lost a lot of genetic diversity. But we didn't know. So that was a question. We also had no idea what the stock structure was in the lake. So we know we have these different spawning populations. There's a big one in Chameau, there's a couple new ones we found, and there's a big one over in the Bay of Quinte. But the degree to which these populations are connected, or whether they are genetically similar or dissimilar, we had no idea. And finally, we were interested in looking at hybridization with whitefish, which I am excited to talk about in a few slides. So this is a map with some of the features gone, just to make it more interesting. So PowerPoint always likes to play tricks on you. There's a lake in here. It's labeled. Imagine that there's a lake. But what we did to answer these questions was we gathered as many genetic samples from different populations around the lake as we could. And we had a few different spawning populations, the Chameau Bay population, the Bay of Quinte population. We also were able to get some historical samples from a place in Ontario called Wellington that used to have a commercial fishery but no longer does. Those are from the 1980s. And we also got some samples from midwater trawl samples that were collected in the summer. So not spawning populations, and we were kind of treating those as potentially admixed groups in the summer. And using all of these samples that we got, we had a 7 microsatellite panel to look at genetic diversity. And overall, we found really good news for Cisco genetic diversity in Lake Ontario. So all the Cisco populations we looked at were pretty diverse. And the especially one nice thing is that they all were very similarly diverse. So it wasn't like one population was, really affected by a bottleneck or high inbreeding or loss of genetic diversity. All the populations seemed to be pretty equally diverse. We also didn't find any evidence of a genetic bottleneck, so that was really encouraging as well. And very large effective population size. So overall, good news for Cisco and Lake Ontario, and it seems that, at least based on our data, a lot of the fears we had about dealing with a really low diversity inbred population did not materialize. This is a structure graph, to look at population structure among the different spawning populations. So we had all of our different Cisco populations, but we also had Lake Whitefish collected from Chameau Bay to use as an outgroup. And when we looked at population structure, we found that the best supported model was for 2 populations, 1 Cisco and 1 Whitefish. So they are 2 different species. Yay. Just in case you were wondering. Within the Cisco populations, though, we didn't find any evidence of structure between the different ones. So that means that at least some population exchange is probably occurring. And I always tell the managers this, just because there's no genetic differentiation between the populations doesn't mean there's demographic population structure. So it really only takes 1 or 2 migrants a generation to erode the type of genetic structure that we're looking at here. So this is not this doesn't mean that all the Cisco are just going out in the lake and mixing around willy-nilly. They might still have site fidelity and being returning to either Chameau or the Bay of Quinte to spawn. Fish and Wildlife Service actually is doing a acoustic tagging telemetry project on that right now. They're implanting acoustic tags into fish from Chameau Bay and then tracking their movements around Lake Ontario to see if they come back to the same site every year to spawn, and also answer a couple other movement questions we have. So hopefully that will give us a better idea in a couple of years of straying rate and maybe some other questions on population structure in the lake. One cool thing to come out of the structure plot is that there were these weird individuals that were half green and half red. And those are hybrids, wild hybrids, that were included in the Cisco population samples. So I'll talk about those next. So one of our big questions was, are Cisco and Whitefish hybridizing? And yes, they are. So for many years, there have been reports of Cisco mules. That's what the fishermen call them in the Bay of Quinte. And they're adult fish that are sometimes caught during the whitefish commercial fishery that look kind of halfway in between a Cisco and a whitefish. And we thought those might be hybrids. Something that we've also seen in Chameau Bay is that there's sometimes an overlap in spawning time and location between these 2 species. So in what I would say a normal year is, we'll have a nice long fall where it cools down slowly over a long period of time. And in that case, we have whitefish coming in and spawning and then leaving, and then about 2 weeks goes by, and then the Cisco come in and spawn and leave. In some falls in the last few years, there's been a different cooling down pattern. So in some of the falls, it's been really hot later. It stays hot. And when I say hot, this is all relative. Hot for Lake Ontario in November. So 40, stays warmer later and then will cool down quickly all at once. And in those cases, we've seen whitefish and Cisco in the trap nets on the shoals at the same time. So there's potential for interbreeding and potential hybridization at those times. Another thing that we were worried about was some of the issues we were having with IDing the larvae. And I didn't present the larval results here, but early on when I started my project, I was doing a lot of larval studies and trying to key out larvae between Cisco and whitefish, which look very, very similar. And I was just having a heck of a time doing it. I could not do it. I could not key out a single larvae. And I was really starting to doubt my abilities as a larval identifier, which if you didn't know what I did before this, all I did before this was ID larvae. So I was really starting to have some doubts. But what we ended up doing is deciding to genetically ID some of the larvae and find out if what we were looking at were Cisco and whitefish. And it turned out all we had were Cisco, but they just had intermediate larval characteristics. So whereas the key would say, if it has 38 muscle bands, it's a whitefish. If it has less, it's a Cisco. They would have, either exactly 38 or they'd have the whitefish number. So that was really throwing us off. And so once we figured that out, we started to get worried that maybe the reason we were having these intermediate larval characteristics was because we were seeing a really high hybridization rate between the two species, and maybe they were mixing so much that the larvae no longer looked like Cisco or whitefish. So in order to answer these questions of whether they were hybridizing and to what rate, we had to develop some new markers. So we developed a panel of 3 new genetic markers that can ID Cisco and whitefish hybrids. And if you look over here on this gel, you can see the whitefish over here on the left have one band, and then the Cisco over here on the right show a different band, but the hybrids in the middle show both bands. So it's a pretty clear, easy way to ID Cisco or like whitefish or a hybrid. And we have 3 of these new markers. And using those few markers, we tested them on a variety of adults that had been collected from the Bay of Quinte and from Chameau, and also on some larvae as well. And we were able to identify 11 adult hybrids from Bay of Quinte samples. One thing that was really cool about those is that 3 of them had banding patterns that suggested that they were F2 back crosses. So a lot of times when we get these fish from the fishermen call them mules, and they also say that, the mules are sterile, like they don't have eggs or they don't have milk or something. But at least, it looks like at least some of them are fertile and can come back and cross again with other Cisco whitefish and create back crosses. And this was confirmed when we found an adult hybrid from Chameau Bay as a female, and we know she was a female because she was full of eggs. So she was a hybrid, she was back there during spawning time on the shoals, ready to spawn, full of eggs. So at least some of these hybrids are fertile and able to breed again. So in order to look at the rate, though, because these were just opportunistically collected adults, we couldn't really get at a rate. In order to look at the rate, we looked at our 3 marker panel on a set of larvae that we collected in 2014 in Chameau Bay. And that was over 700 larvae. So we ran all 700 larvae through with these 3 markers, and out of all 700, we only found 1 hybrid. So at least in that year, it was a very low hybridization rate. It was just about 0.01%. That year, though, was a pretty typical, what I would say, year for fall cooling, and we didn't see a lot of overlap in spawn time between whitefish and Cisco. So going into the future, it'll be interesting to see how that rate changes in different years. So now we are going into the future. And thinking about the future was bringing up a lot of things I could potentially talk about when we talk about the future of Cisco research in Lake Ontario. But the 2 things that I want to focus on are science communication and outreach, and also climate change, of course. So when we first began this Sea Grant project that funded my PhD, we had to outline an outreach plan, and that's something that's becoming a lot more common with different grant proposals nowadays. And originally we just decided to do like the generic standard fisheries research or outreach plan, which is at the end of your project, after many years of research, you do 1 PowerPoint presentation for a public seminar. And then as I was thinking about it, I realized, like, nobody knows what these things are. Like, what fisherman is going to come to a public seminar on a fish that they've never even heard of and probably don't really care about? So we decided we needed a new plan. And I wanted to start doing outreach and communicating with the public and getting information about Cisco out to our public throughout the project. And so we decided to use social media for that. And it has, so in 2017 I started this Great Lakes Cisco account on Twitter. And it has been just a wonderful experience, and I recommend it for many people. I've loved doing science communication and outreach on Twitter, and it's been like a really encouraging and really bright part of this PhD experience. And when this account started, we had one identified target audience, and that was people, the public. People are saying the public, but you actually have to be a little bit more focused when you say the public. So our public was people living, working, recreating in and around the Great Lakes. However, even though that was our target audience, we quickly amassed a separate audience, which is other Great Lakes scientists. So it's very easy to attract other Great Lakes scientists or other scientists to your Twitter account. So before too long, I found myself communicating to these two distinct groups of people, and there's different strategies for communicating to each individual group. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I talked to those two different audiences. First up, though, communicating with the public. So I think that one of the big strengths of social media is that it lets people be behind the scenes in your science. So when you think about the traditional way that science is communicated to the public, usually what happens is a researcher or a grad student starts working on a project for several years, and then at the end, there will be a paper or something that comes out. And if you're lucky, it might go to your university's PR department, and they might release a press release a while later. And that press release kind of just comes down from on high and tells the people what's what. And that's kind of the traditional communication pathway for academic research. But the nice thing about sharing the research while it's happening, and especially through social media, is that it's a behind-the-scenes look, and people really like to be behind the scenes. It's not just information coming down from on high. It allows them to learn about and start to get emotionally invested in and care about the topic that you're researching. They care about the progress of your project and how, if it's successful or if it has failures, and allows them to be a lot more involved. And two ways that I especially have liked to communicate is one is through live streaming, which I'm doing right now. Live streaming is really great because social media already is a behind the scenes, and live streaming is like the ultimate behind the scenes. So I actually live stream from the field as much as I can. It's really fun. I just get a live stream started when we're out sampling, show people what we're working on. They can watch us work up fish, and the really great thing about live streaming is that people can actually interact with you and ask questions. So it's pretty easy to comment on Periscope and just type a question into the comment box. And when that comes up, I can actually address that question right away and say, oh, thanks so-and-so, thanks for that question. Here's the answer, blah, blah, blah. And it's more of a back and forth. And so that's a really great way to do it. Unfortunately, with the nature of fieldwork, you often don't have good enough cell service or internet to actually do live streaming. So that has been a challenge before. But in that case, I do also take a lot of like GoPro video and photos and things like that. And then I'll stitch them together when I get back into videos that I'll upload on YouTube and share on Twitter. So those are also really great for behind the scenes, although it's not, it doesn't have that really great communicative aspect with the back and forth on live streaming. The second thing that I've really enjoyed doing on Twitter and also on some of just old school chat rooms and forums like iceshanty.com is talking to anglers and getting fishing reports from them. So most anglers never see a Cisco because they're out there fishing in the summer and they're not going to catch them. But ice fishermen, on the other hand, ice fishermen do have the chance to catch a Cisco. And one thing that we've been seeing in the last few years is more and more reports of ice fishermen catching Cisco. And most of the time, they have no idea what they are. They get this weird fish they've never seen before that comes up through the hole in the ice. They post a picture on Ice Shanty. Nobody knows what it is. And then I swoop in and I tell them it's a Cisco. But through Twitter and through Ice Shanty and Facebook, I've been getting a lot more anglers reporting Cisco catches to me, and that's great for a couple of reasons. One reason is because it's another behind-the-scenes communication, two-way communication thing. So I am not just giving information to the fishermen. The fishermen are giving me information as well, and it's a two-way street. So not only are they learning about Cisco, but I'm learning about Cisco because these ice fishermen reports have been really helpful in tracking the movement of Cisco around the eastern basin of Lake Ontario. They're starting to show up in bays in the winter that we haven't always seen them in. And actually, a couple of the sampling sites where we looked for remnant spawning populations were picked because we got reports from ice fishermen that they were starting to catch more Cisco there. So it's been really, really helpful. And then not only am I receiving information, but the fishermen themselves can be involved in the science and be contributing data to science. Okay, so that was my first audience, which is the public. My second audience is other scientists. And I mentioned that it is sometimes hard to connect to a target audience like fishermen. It's definitely not hard to connect to other scientists on Twitter. There is a wonderful, very welcoming, big, great group of scientists on Twitter that love to talk to each other about science. So this has been another really great experience for social media outreach. And one story I want to tell you about today is about using live streaming at conferences, which is something that I've gotten a lot more involved in the last couple of years. So the conference that's depicted here is the Cornell Symposium, which was held in Bayfield, Wisconsin in 2017. And the Cornell Symposium is for people who study crigonines, so Cisco, whitefish, bloater, and not just in the Great Lakes, but all around the globe. Usually it's not a meeting that a lot of people get to go to because it's usually held in somewhere like Finland, which is where it's going to be next year. But this year, or in 2017, it was held in Wisconsin. So it was finally a place that a lot of Americans and Canadians were going to be able to actually attend. And not only that, but it really coincided with this like resurgence in interest in Cisco restoration around the Great Lakes. So it was really good timing for it to be held in the U.S. Unfortunately, though, a lot of people were not able to come to the conference because, limited conference travel funds. But also it's a small conference, so relatively expensive. And a lot of people had travel restrictions. The agencies they worked for weren't going to grant them travel access or something like that. But unfortunately, a lot of these people were people that really needed to be involved in the conversation and needed to be talking about new advances and new discoveries in Cisco research and thinking about collaboratively moving forward with Cisco restoration in the Great Lakes. So we wanted to make sure that they were part of the conversation as well. And so we decided to live stream the entire conference, basically. And I got permission from about 3/4 of the speakers to live stream their talks on Periscope and Twitter. And then every day I posted a schedule on Twitter that would list what talks were going to be available for that day. And then people could tune in and watch. And because it was a live stream, if they had questions during it, they could type the questions in, and then on their behalf, I would ask them during the Q&A session. So it was really allowed a lot of people to be involved that otherwise wouldn't have been in this conference. And over on the right, one really cool thing we did at this conference that isn't usually done is we actually live streamed posters too. So if any of you have done a poster at a conference, you might not get a very good reach out of that poster. We say, you're sitting by your poster, you worked so hard on your poster, and you're standing there waiting for people to come by, and maybe 3 people will come by your poster, if the snacks are nearby, potentially. So the nice thing about live streaming the poster is that it really expanded the reach of that poster session. So what I do is I would start the live, I put them on the schedule just like with the other talks. started the live stream, introduced the speaker, and then let them talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, just giving an overview of the project. And then I had about 5 to 10 minutes of question and answer, where either I asked questions or people watching the live stream asked questions. And that was really, really successful. We got way more views out of a poster from putting them online than we would have at the conference. And then another nice thing is that all of these videos, both the talks and the posters, were then uploaded onto YouTube later. So anybody who missed it, or anybody who wanted to return to that information, could go back and watch those talks over again. This is my social network. So this is a Netlytic map, social network map that was made with Netlytic, and shows everybody that has mentioned or retweeted me in the last year on Twitter. And this big cluster over here, those are all scientists. So you can see, not hard to get them talking about Cisco on Twitter. The people in the purple are Cornell SciComm people. So Cornell Best is in there. Bruce, you're in there. But the people I really want to focus on are these people in the yellow. These are anglers and outdoor enthusiasts. There are some yellow folks in this giant cluster, and so those are anglers and outdoor enthusiasts that are also following, commenting on, mentioning science accounts. But the big thing I wanted to show here is how those few people can really help you reach other people that are completely separate from this little science bubble that's going on Twitter. So a lot of, the talk in the last few years about social media is that you're just preaching to the choir. You're in your little bubble. How do you ever break out? And this is it. This is the breakout that we're trying to focus on. So Netlytic is really great. If you are involved in social media outreach, a lot of times people just rely on guesswork to figure out if they're being effective. This is a really great tool. Just in the last minute or so, I want to talk about the big future thing, climate change, and how it will impact Cisco. We're not really sure how Cisco are going to be impacted by climate change, but there's a few things that we are worried about going into the future. One of which is an increase potentially in the hybridization rate that I talked about. So in the future, we're expecting more warm falls that that stay warm later, potentially more overlap in spawning between Cisco and Whitefish, and a hybridization rate. So while we're not super worried about that low hybridization rate now, that might become an issue in the future. The other thing we're worried about is loss of ice cover. So there's some good evidence that shows that Cisco might rely on really solid, stable ice cover during the winter to have a good year class, good recruitment. But in the future, when we get more volatile ice cover, warmer winters, freeze-thaw cycles, there's some worry about how they'll be affected there. Hannah LaChance at University of Vermont is doing some really cool work too on looking at how loss of ice cover affects Cisco egg development by increasing exposure to light. So it's not just the loss of ice cover and the loss of the physical protection of the ice. It's other environmental factors that could be involved. And right now we're really focused in Lake Ontario on studying these near-shore spawning populations, like in Chameau Bay, and that's where a lot of the research is focused on. But there's other populations around the Great Lakes that show different spawning strategies. And for example, spawning deeper, spawning offshore, spawning either in deep water or over deep water. And so I think it's important to think about some of these alternate strategies moving forward in the face of climate change. With that, I would like to thank everybody. Thank you for sitting through my talk. Thank you to my committee, Lars, Matt, Bruce, and Suresh. Nature Conservancy and Sea Grant for the funding for all of this work, and of course everybody that helped out, all of you for watching, everybody online for watching, and that is it. I tried to keep it short, but I just can't stop talking about Cisco.
Can't stop talking about Cisco.
Sorry.
Okay, questions?
Yes, yeah.
So if the Cisco were pretty much decimated from the fishery, why do you think it is that you don't see any bottlenecks to our loss of genetic variation? Was there some remnant population that just wasn't discovered, or what do you think?
That's so fun. Matt and I were just talking about this literally a half hour before we talked. And we were talking about how that's part of the theory is that if you have a huge demographic decline, the theory is that that always will translate to a population bottleneck. But in a lot of populations such as cod and like other marine species with really large effective population sizes, they can lose a huge portion of the population and not show a signature. So that's actually something that we're kind of exploring for this chapter, to see if we can pull together some other case studies and figure out if this is something that always happens or not necessarily. But yeah, we didn't see any signature of a bottleneck in this case, even though they definitely went through a huge demographic decline. I mean, there used to be spawning populations that supported fishes all around the lake, and then it went down to very few. But I think you are right in guessing that there might have been remnant populations. I don't know for sure. Those remnants that we found, we have no idea if those are new or old. But one of the things that was really curious to me about going through that remnant spawning stock potential site map that I created is that there's a lot of really good-looking habitat that's way out in the lake in the eastern basin that's completely inaccessible to us in the winter. It's just not safe to go out there in the winter. The storms are crazy. Anything that's slightly out in the lake is just really touch and go. And I've been curious for a long time to figure out if there's actually a lot more spawning going on out there that we have no idea is existing. But I think there needs to be a development in sampling techniques or something that will allow us to sample out there to figure out if it's going on, because there could be a population out there that we have no idea exists. Taylor, yeah.
I have a question from Periscope.
Awesome.
So it's from @Beljotman, who is actually an ecologist watching from India.
Oh, cool.
And their question is asking if, in terms of Cisco restoration, if comparing the physical habitat present now in the lake and comparing that with the historical habitat of the Cisco will help inform science about
Awesome.
Cisco.
Good question. Yeah, I think, so one of the things that's often been cited as one of the factors contributing to the decline in Lake Ontario was a loss of good spawning habitat. I don't know if we actually have any good quantification on loss of spawning habitat. So it's something that you see when you read like old reports that say, gravel mining in the eastern part of the lake destroyed a lot of habitat by taking out a lot of rock, or sawdust spoils from sawmills covered the spawning shoals and destroyed spawning habitat. While there's a lot of reports of that, I don't think we have a really good data set to actually compare that. So if we were able to come up with some sort of way to compare those, I think it would be informative. But the fact is right now that I think, at least based on our Sidescan Sonar maps of the lake and some of the habitat characterization that we did for that remnant spawning site study, there is a lot of rock habitat on the eastern side of the lake. So it doesn't, at least doesn't seem like that's the thing that's limiting them right now. Wade, yeah.
So thanks a lot. This is super cool. My question is about the hybrids. So sometimes with hybridization, you can get kind of overexpression of some kind of trait, and I wonder if there are any implications for the thymidase. They might naturally be low, but could lead to some overexpression.
So you're saying that they're low in the whitefish, low in the Cisco,
Well, I don't know
and
if they're low in the whitefish.
Okay, they are. Yes, they're low. Thymidase is generally low in Cisco and low in whitefish as well. But then you're asking if.
Yeah, sometimes like if you combine two things that are expressing low, you can get a product that's higher than
That's a very interesting question. I think that is a great thing for one of Wes Larson's grad students to look at.
Wes said great job, so he is watching.
Okay, hi Wes. There's a few people just in the last couple of years who have started looking at expressed genes and expressed phenotypes in Cisco. It's pretty early on, but I think that would be a good question to look into. But at least all the native fish species tend to have very low, or at least the ones that we're talking about, the progenies, tend to just have low thymidase across the board. Yeah. Yes, Pete.
So Lake Ontario is a really big lake. And so you talked about this one region in the far east, and there are fisheries scattered around the perimeter of Ontario, but there's still probably big stretches between the kind of landing sites, so to speak. So what's your intuition about history? If you go back to the late 19th century, do you think they were really hammering Cisco everywhere, or was it just a handful of locations?
historically, there were fisheries all around the lake, but the big fisheries and most of the concentration of fisheries were on the eastern side. So they were always more associated with the eastern half of the lake, although there were some big fisheries out of Hamilton Harbor over in the western side of the lake, and a few others scattered around. But generally they were always associated more strongly with the eastern side.
Well, I see
Okay.
Nina is looking at the time. So let's give Helen another hand. Ellen and I and anybody that wants to come along is going to go to the Statler and have some beers.
We're doing committee grilling?
What?
At the Statler.
No, the committee grilling is happening several weeks away, and you're not allowed to grill there at all after this. Live stream people, you have to provide your own beers. I'm sorry. Thank you all for coming.
So is the...
Good job.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, but it's true when you're saying that even like the bottom of the like the arms, it's not just those bottlenecks you still have a lot of power, but it's directly that's going to But other skills and these places, because we're the ones that you said you're